You step outside, just as the light begins to gather over the eastern edge of the common fields. A slow brightening that seems to creep across the thatch and the bare earth without any single moment of arrival. The air holds the cool weight of an autumn morning in 1570, dry and thin, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a chimney not yet lit and the damp green smell of the grass beyond the garden wall. You pick up your Hayward staff from its place by the door, a length of smooth ash, worn to a darker polish where your hand grips it each day, and close the cottage door behind you without a sound. The leather hinges give only a soft creak that vanishes at once into the stillness. The village lies quiet, the roofs still dark and damp from the night, the plaster and timber of the houses all the same shade of grey in the half-light. No one else is abroad. You see no candle glow in any window, hear no footstep on the lane. You stand for a moment in the yard, letting your eyes adjust to the world outside after the close darkness of the room where you slept, noting the feel of the packed earth beneath your boots, the way it gives slightly in the center of the path where countless steps have worn a shallow hollow over years. There is no hurry. The first task is simply to begin, to walk the boundary with slow attention, the same way it has been done every day through this season and every autumn before that, stretching back into a time no one can remember. You recall the shape of the route ahead, not as a list of places, but as a single continuous feeling in the legs and the memory. It is a long loop that will take the whole morning and a part of the afternoon, tracing the edges where the village strips meet the waste and the woodland, following first the lower pasture fence, then a ditch and hedge, then the upper common, a brook, a cart track, a line of furlong stones, the sheep wash dip, and at last the village lane back to your own door. The whole circuit is familiar to you. The way of prayer is familiar, each portion of it known not by name, but by the slight differences in the ground underfoot, the sound of water or the absence of it, the way the light falls at certain turns. Already you can feel the rhythm of the walk settling into your legs, a steady, unbroken cadence that will carry you through the hours without excitement or change. Your feet will lift and lower, the staff will tap the earth every other stride, and the world will pass by you in a slow roll of fields and hedgerows that never alters. You take the first few paces across the yard, passing the low stone wall that keeps the chickens from the lane and noting with a glance that its coping stones are all in place. A single blackbird watches you from the ridge of the cottage roof, its head cocked, before it flies off into the orchard without a call. At the gate you pause again, not from uncertainty, but from an old habit of beginning the boundary walk with a deliberate still point. A kind of breath taken before the long movement starts. The gate is a simple thing of woven withy, light enough to be lifted aside rather than swung, and you lift it now and set it back against the post with care that the withy does not catch and fray. Beyond the gate, the village lane runs a short way to the east, before diving between two houses and emerging at the edge of the common field. The lane is unpaved, its surface a mix of packed chalk and small flints that glisten with the morning damp, and your boots make a quiet scuffing sound as you begin to walk along its center. There is no wheel rime at this hour, just the parallel grooves left by yesterday's cart that you step across without thinking. The houses on either side remain shuttered, their gardens a tangle of bean poles and the last yellow leaves of the marrows. You pass the smithy with its great double doors closed and the scent of cold iron still hanging in the air around it, a sharp tang that catches at the back of your throat. Then the bakehouse with its whitewashed wall and the single high window that reflects nothing but the grey sky. A cat sits on the step of the weaver's cottage, watching you with the slow blink of an animal that has seen you pass at this hour every day and finds nothing remarkable in it. You walk on without altering your pace, your staff swinging forward in a gentle arc that matches the movement of your right leg, and the lane soon opens out into the first glimpse of the common fields. Here the ground changes from packed chalk to a softer, grass-grown track that marks the start of the boundary proper. The track runs along the headland of the first great ploughed strip, a furlong of pale stubble that stretches away to the north in a slight curve, following the contour of the land. You stop for a moment to look across the field, taking in the long parallel ridges where the plough had turned the soil weeks ago and left it to weather, the furrows between them already holding a fine fuzz of chickweed and speedwell that will need weeding in the spring. Nothing moves on the field. The rooks are still in the distant elms, and the small birds that flit in the hedges have not yet started their first busy flights. The whole scene is held in a paused silence that feels as old as the earth itself, a silence that belongs to the hour just before the world fully wakes. You turn your attention to the track that now becomes your guide, a narrow strip of trodden grass and earth that runs between the ploughed land and the rough meadow beyond. This track is the first leg of the boundary walk, and you step onto it with the same foot you always use, your left, a habit so ingrained that you would not notice it unless you stopped to think. The grass on either side of the track is long and wet, brushing against your boot tops and leaving dark streaks of moisture on the leather. You do not mind the wet, it is simply part of the morning, a coolness that seeps in slowly and will dry as the day progresses. You walk with your eyes moving in a steady sweep from the ground just ahead of your feet to the middle distance, never fixing on one thing for long, but letting the whole field of vision remain soft and open. The way your father taught you when you first began this work as a boy. In that soft gaze, anything out of place would register at once. A sudden gap in the hedge, a fallen branch, the white shape of a sheep where it should not be. But this morning, nothing calls your attention. The light continues to strengthen by degrees, though the sun itself remains hidden behind a high veil of cloud that seems to stretch from horizon to horizon without a single break. The quality of the light is pearlescent, without sharp shadows, so that the furrows of the field look as if they have been smoothed over by a gentle hand. You find this light restful. It asks nothing of the eye, creates no glare, simply reveals each thing in its own quiet color. The stubble is amber grey, the meadow grass a dull green touched with brown at the tips, the hedge a dark tangle of hawthorn and bramble that holds the night's dampness in its depths. A single strand of old man's beard trails from a hazel stem, its seed heads fluffed out into silver-white stars that catch what little light there is. You pass it by, and your shoulder brushes the hazel, sending a few drops of collected dew down onto the grass with a faint pattering sound that dies away at once. As you walk, you begin the first of the quiet checks that make up your work, the half-conscious inventory of the boundary's condition. The grass on the track is not too worn. No new path has been broken through the hedge by an animal seeking a shorter way. The marks of hooves you see here and there are old, rounded at the edges from the previous day's rain, not fresh. The hedge itself is dense and unbroken, its lower branches interwoven with briars that have grown thick through the summer and now in the autumn have begun to harden into tough woody strands. You run your staff lightly along the top of the hedge as you walk, a habit rather than a true inspection, the wood tapping against the occasional thicker branch with a sound like a muted drum. Where the hedge meets the first corner of the lower pasture fence, you stop for a longer look, your eyes travelling along the line of posts and rails that will be your next concern. The pasture fence begins at a massive old oak that stands at the corner of the field, its trunk so broad that 3 men could not link hands around it. The bark is deeply furrowed, a landscape of miniature ridges and valleys that runs with dark lines of moss in the cracks. One heavy limb stretches out over the fence itself, its leaves still plentiful, but browning at the edges, and a few acorns lie scattered on the grass beneath, their cups empty and dry. You approach the tree and set your hand flat against its trunk, feeling the cool, rough surface and the solid, unyielding mass of it. The tree is a marker, the fixed point from which the fence line is measured, and you always greet it with this small touch, a recognition that it has stood through another night and remains true. From here, the fence runs straight for 200 paces across the lower pasture, dividing the grazing ground from the hay meadow that lies on the other side. Its purpose is simple and ancient: to keep the village cows from wandering into the meadow before the last cut of hay is gathered and stacked, the winter feed secured. You leave the oak and begin to walk the fence line, your hand now moving to the top rail as you go, feeling the grain of the wood under your palm. The fence is made of split oak posts set into the ground at intervals of about 4 paces, with 3 horizontal rails fitted into mortise holes and held by tapered pegs. The wood has weathered to a silvery grey, and in places patches of pale green lichen spread like little maps across the surface. You move slowly, your eyes running from rail to rail, checking for splinters that might tear the hide of an animal leaning against them, for nails that have worked loose and now protrude slightly, for a rail that has sagged and rests too close to the ground to be an effective barrier. The top rail is smooth and unbroken under your hand. The middle rail is firm. The bottom rail sits evenly in its notches, with a clear, consistent gap between it and the grass that a lamb could not squeeze through. At the 10th post, you notice a slight give in the middle rail when you press it with your thumb, a movement no more than the width of a barley grain. You stop, not because this is urgent, but because the habit of attention demands that you understand the cause. Crouching down, you see that the peg on the near side has worn slightly, its end no longer filling the mortise completely, so that the rail can rock within its seat. You make a mental note to bring a spare peg on the next walk, or to tell the carpenter when you see him, and then you rise and continue, the observation filed away in the quiet catalogue you keep for each day's circuit. Beyond the slight movement of that one rail, the fence is sound. You walk every pace of its length, your hand trailing across the top rail in a slow, continuous motion, the wood alternately cool and slightly warmer where the sky's diffused light has touched it for longer. The grass on the pasture side has been cropped short by sheep, leaving a tidy sward dotted with the small, flat rosettes of daisies that have closed up for the night, and not yet opened to the absent sun. On the meadow side, the grass stands taller and rougher, a mix of rye and fescue gone to seed, the stems whispering against each other in the faint breath of a breeze that stirs for a moment and then stills. The meadow will be cut in a week or two, depending on the weather, and the hay will be raked into windrows and then built into a stack at the barn end, where you will later check the hurdles that enclose it. For now, it simply waits, a wide russet gold expanse that stretches to the next boundary hedge, and you feel a quiet satisfaction in seeing it untouched. Where the fence line ends, it turns sharply left at the old oak that marks the second corner, and here you pause to look back along the way you have come, checking the line of posts against the horizon to see if any have leaned during the night. They are all straight, their tops making an even series of dark points against the pale sky, and you turn your back on them to follow the boundary into the shallow ditch that now becomes your path. The ditch runs along the bottom of a gentle slope, carrying off the rain that drains from the common field above, and alongside it rises a hedge of hawthorn and blackthorn planted so long ago that the individual bushes have merged into a single continuous wall of thorn. The ditch itself is half filled with last year's leaves, the pale papery skeletons of beech and the thicker, darker mat of oak, mixed with the brittle stalks of dead nettles and the occasional curled brown fern. Your walk now slows to a different pace, not from weariness, but from the care required to read the ground. You step down into the bottom of the ditch, your boots pressing into the soft, damp leaf litter, and you begin to work your way along it, one slow step after another, your eyes scanning the banks and the water channel at the center. This part of the walk is quieter if that is possible, the sound of your footsteps muffled by the layers of decay and the high sides of the ditch cutting off the wider view, so that all you see is the close detail of earth and root and the occasional stone. You look into the ditch to see if any earth has crumbled in from the sides, loosened by the last rain or by the scrabbling of some creature, and you find one place where a rabbit has begun a scrape, a shallow hollow with fresh, dark soil at its mouth. You knock the loose earth back into place with the heel of your boot and press it firm, knowing that a rabbit hole near the hedge can become a passageway for a lamb if left unchecked. A stick serves to prod the bottom of the ditch, checking the depth of the silt that gathers each autumn, and though it is built up to the thickness of your palm, it is not yet enough to block the flow of water when the winter rains come. You will need to mention it at the next manor court, so that a day can be given to digging it out, but that is a thought for another day, not for now. On the hedge side you walk close enough for the thorns to catch at the shoulder of your tunic, a rough grey wool that resists them without tearing. Your eyes trace the interlaced branches, marking where the blackthorn has put out new shoots that have hardened into sharp, dark spikes, and where an elder has seated itself and now grows as a sapling within the hedge's thickness. The elder you leave, because its leaves and berries will feed the birds, and its wood will one day make a good peg or whistle for a child. At one point you find a gap where a hawthorn branch has died back over the summer, its bark peeling and its twigs brittle, leaving a space just wide enough for a stray ewe to push through and wander into the next strip. You break off the dead wood with a quiet snap, the sound sharp but small, and lay the pieces across the gap in a rough lattice. a temporary mend that will hold until the farmer can come with a billhook and cut a live branch to weave in properly. The work takes only a moment, and you wipe the flakes of dry bark from your hands onto your tunic before moving on. The ditch gradually shallows as the ground levels out, and you climb out of it at the point where the hedge gives way to a low bank of earth dotted with the purple-tinged leaves of herb robert and the last few flowers of red campion, their petals half closed and heavy with moisture. From here, the boundary leads you up a very gentle rise toward the upper common, and you pause for a moment at the top of the slope, not because you need to rest, but because the change in the land offers a wider view that is worth taking in. Before you stretches the upper common, a wide stretch of rough grazing dotted with gorse bushes that are still carrying a few yellow flowers despite the lateness of the season, and tufts of coarse grass that grow in tussocks scattered across the slope like uncombed fleece. The sky remains a single even sheet of pale cloud, the light still soft, and the world is entirely silent except for the calls of rooks and the distant elms, a cawing that rises and falls with a rhythmic predictability, like a slow breathing. You stand there with your staff planted and your weight evenly on both feet, and you feel the whole morning settle into a calm steadiness that is both familiar and complete, as if the walk itself has now truly begun and will continue without variation into the hours ahead, carrying you forward through the quiet circuit of the fields. That is the way of it. You do not think in words exactly. Rather, a simple awareness fills the space behind your eyes, an awareness that the boundary is here, that you are walking it, that the land under your care is at peace. You take a slow, deep breath of the cool air, feeling it move into your chest and leave again without effort, and then you resume your walk, your boots finding the faint track that leads across the common toward the boundary stone you know will be there, grey and solid and unchanged. The rhythm is set now, the steady tap of the staff, the soft crush of grass under leather, the slow sweep of your gaze across the gorse and the grass and the distant line of the Demjne hedge. Nothing calls out for attention, nothing is broken, nothing has strayed, and so you walk on, your mind as quiet as the fields around you, into the stretching hours of the morning. You leave the cottage lane and follow the rutted track down toward the lower pasture, where the grass grows thicker on the heavier soil that holds the damp longer than the upper slopes. The track angles away from the village, running between a low bank of nettles on one side and a narrow runnel on the other that carries a thin trickle of clear water down to the brook. Your boots find the center of the track by habit, stepping between the deeper ruts left by the last hay wains, and the packed surface feels solid underfoot after the softer ground of the lane. The morning light has moved on a little, still without direct sun, still that even pearl-grey sheet that seems to press the whole world into a calm and even tone. You can see the lower pasture now as a wide sweep of green and brown that stretches to a dark line of hedge at the far side, and cutting across it is the fence you've come to check, a straight row of posts and rails that divides the grazing from the hay meadow. The first post of the fence is set beside an old oak that stands alone at the corner, its trunk massive and its branches spreading wide over both sides of the boundary so that the fence passes directly beneath the spread of its canopy. You approach the oak and pause for a moment to look along the line, letting your eyes travel the 200 paces to the far corner where an identical oak marks the other end, and the fence will turn toward the ditch. The posts stand dark against the pale grass, each one a solid shadow that the distance gradually softens, and the rails run between them in 3 straight lines that seem to converge at the far point without a single visible dip or wave. This is a good sign. A fence that has been pushed or strained will show a curve somewhere along its length, but here there is none. You set your hand on the first post, feeling the cool, rough grain of the oak under your palm. The wood weathered to a silvery grey with small patches of pale green lichen spreading like stains across the surface. The post is firm, not rocking, its base set deep in the earth and packed around with stone chippings that have long since settled into a tight collar. You move on, your hand transferring to the top rail, and you begin the slow walk along the fence line. The top rail is the one you check most carefully, because it takes the weight of any animal that leans against it to reach for a sweeter tuft of grass on the other side, and if it should fail, the whole fence might follow. You let your palm slide along the wood, feeling for splinters that could catch the hide of a cow or the fleece of a sheep. For the rough patch, that means the wood has begun to crack along its grain. The rail is smooth for the first 10 paces, worn to a dull polish by your own hand over the weeks of this season, and by the hands of the other Haywards who walk this boundary in the years before you, and whose names are only remembered as a list in the manor roll. You do not think of them as individuals, they are simply the ones who came before, and the proof of their care is in the fence that still stands. At the 11th post you feel a slight roughness, a place where the grain has lifted in a thin sliver no longer than your thumb. You stop and examine it, seeing that the wood has dried and checked in the sun of the past summer, but the splinter is still attached at one end and has not yet separated enough to cause harm. You press it flat with your thumb and rub the spot once with the heel of your hand to smooth it, then continue. The middle rail comes next under your inspection, though you do not touch it in the same way. Instead, you glance along its length at each post, noting the places where the rail sits in its mortise and whether the peg that holds it is still driven flush. A peg that is worked out even a little will show as a dark dot against the surrounding wood, and you see none of these. At one point, you notice that the middle rail has a slight outward bow, as if it once took a push from a heavy animal and bent but did not break, and you make a small mark on the post with your thumbnail to remind yourself to look at it again in a week to see if it has moved any further. The wood is still sound, the fibers holding, and the bow is so slight that you would not notice it if you were not looking for it, with the particular care that a Hayward brings to his work. You walk on, and the middle rail straightens again, and you forget the mark you made even as you make it, filing it somewhere in the back of your mind where such things reside. The bottom rail is the one that matters most for sheep, because they will push their heads under it or their bodies against it to reach the longer grass on the meadow side, and a gap here can let a lamb through into the hay crop, where it can do damage and be hard to find. You walk with your eyes lowered now, watching the space between the bottom rail and the ground, checking that the gap remains even and close, no wider than the width of your outstretched hand in those places where the earth has been worn away by hooves. Halfway along the fence you find a place where a sheep has pushed against the lower rail, leaving a tuft of wool caught on a splinter and a slight outward lean to the rail itself. The wool is coarse and greyish, the kind that comes from the flock's older ewes, and it catches the faint breeze that stirs across the pasture, trembling a little before you reach to pull it free. You stop, crouch, and press the rail back into its notch with a firm, steady pressure that you feel through your shoulders. The rail seats itself with a small, satisfying click of wood against wood, and you see that the peg on the near side is held despite the pressure, the tough oak grain refusing to shear. You stay crouched for a moment longer, running your eyes along the ground to see if any other sign of disturbance remains, but the grass is merely flattened where the ewe stood, and there is no hoof print sunk so deep as to indicate a long struggle. The animal must have leaned, felt the rail give, and then wandered off in search of an easier place. You stand, brushing the dry grass from your knee, and you do not hurry. The morning is long, and the fence is long, and each small repair adds to the whole day's quiet sum of work. Beyond the tuft of wool, the bottom rail continues true. At the next 3 posts, you notice small depressions in the soil where rainwater has pooled and then dried, leaving shallow hollows that might in time undermine the post footing if not filled, but they are still too slight to need anything more than your note. You make that note, adding it to the mental collection that you carry, the list of small things that will need attention when the weather turns and the ground softens further. The grass on the pasture side grows right up to the rails, short and nibbled, dotted with the flat leaves of plantain and the tiny white flowers of daisies that have begun to open now as the day moves toward its middle. On the meadow side the grass is taller, a thick stand of rye and fescue gone to seed, the seed heads heavy and bent, stirring in the lightest movement of air with a soft rustling that is the only sound besides your own footsteps, and the distant steady cawing of the rooks in the elms. At the 3/4 point along the fence, you encounter a rail that has sagged and now rests too close to the ground, the gap beneath it narrowing to less than the width of a clenched fist. The cause is a post that has settled unevenly, the earth around its base having been softened by an old mole run that finally collapsed, leaving a small cavity on one side. You crouch again and scrape away the loose soil with your fingers, finding the mole's tunnel a finger's length down. a smooth-walled passage that runs under the post and out the other side. The post is still sound, but the settling has dropped the rail in its mortise so that the whole section slopes. You gather several stones from the pile that has been collected at the base of the oak for this purpose, a small cairn of field flints and broken cobbles, and you carry them back 2 at a time, tucking them into the cavity beneath the post until the ground is filled and packed. Then you lift the rail with both hands, heaving it up just enough to slip the peg tighter and to restore the proper gap. The rail now sits as it should, and you test it with a downward push to be sure it will not slip again. The stones you used are the same color as the soil, grey and brown, and within a week they will have settled and become invisible, part of the earth that holds the post. You wipe your hands on the coarse cloth of your tunic and rise, the small ache in your knees, a familiar and not unpleasant reminder of the work. The final length of the fence runs straight to the second oak, and you walk it without finding anything further to set right. Here at the corner the fence turns sharply left, following the oak's spread, and the top rail meets the trunk at a point where a deep hollow has been worn into the bark by the rubbing of cattle over many generations. The hollow is smooth and dark, and you set your hand into it briefly, feeling the polished wood that is almost as warm as skin. The oak itself is ancient, far older than the village, older than the field system itself perhaps, and its roots spread out in great twisting ridges that break the surface of the grass and catch the fallen leaves in their crooks. You stand under its branches and look up into the canopy, seeing the last of the acorns still clinging to the twigs. The leaves a deep brown green that will soon turn fully and fall. A small bird, a wren, flits from one branch to another and vanishes into a thick clump of ivy that climbs the trunk on the far side, and its movement is the only living thing you have seen since the cat on the weaver's step. From the oak, the fence line turns and disappears into a shallow ditch that runs away across the bottom of the next field, and this is where the boundary now leads. You step away from the fence at last, leaving your hand trailing on the top rail until you are out of reach, and you turn to follow the new direction without breaking stride. The ditch begins as a slight depression in the grass, no more than a fold in the ground, but as you walk it deepens slowly until its sides rise to the height of your knees and a narrow channel of bare earth runs along the bottom, waiting for the autumn rains to fill it. On your left the pasture continues, but a low hedge now runs along the ditch's far bank, a dense tangle of hawthorn and blackthorn that separates the pasture from the ploughed strips of the open field beyond. This hedge will be the subject of the next part of your walk, a length of careful inspection that will take you along its full extent, checking for breaks and dead limbs, and already you can see the beginning of it rising dark and thick against the pale sky. For now, you simply walk, your feet finding the narrow path along the lip of the ditch, and the rhythm of the morning reasserts itself in the steady pad of your boots on the grass, and the slow, even sweep of your gaze from side to side. The light is still soft, the rooks still call from the elms, and the world continues in its quiet, unbroken round, holding nothing more urgent than a fence that has been checked, and a rail that has been pressed back into place. Beyond the oak, the boundary follows a narrow ditch that cuts a dark line across the lower edge of the pasture before curving gently to run alongside a low hedge, the two of them travelling together for a full furlong before separating at the next field corner. The ditch is not deep. At its greatest it reaches the height of a man's knee, but in most places it is shallower, a broad trough carved into the heavy clay soil so long ago that the sides have weathered to a soft slope and the bottom has filled with the accumulation of many seasons. As you leave the fence line and step down into this new part of your walk, the ground changes underfoot from the firm grass to a layer of dry, crackling leaves that have blown in from the hedge and settled here, leaves of hawthorn and ash and the occasional broader leaf of the oak you have just left. The leaves lie in drifts, pale brown and curled, and your boots press into them with a sound that is less a crunch and more a soft, papery sigh. The hedge itself rises on your right side as you walk the ditch bottom, a thick, tangled wall of hawthorn and blackthorn that has been planted generations ago to divide the open field strips of two neighbouring yeomen, the parson's land on one side and the glebe on the other, though those names belong to the manor roll and not to the hedge itself. The hedge knows nothing of ownership, it simply grows, year after year, putting out new shoots from old stumps, knitting its branches together so closely that in summer it is a solid mass of green, and now in autumn it is a brown-grey lattice of thorn and twig and the pale, brittle skeletons of dead nettle stems. At intervals an elder has seated itself, its bark rough and corky, and its leaves have already yellowed and fallen, so that only the dark purple clusters of berries remain, hanging in heavy bunches that the birds will strip as the winter deepens. You walk with your left shoulder toward the pasture, and your right hand free to touch the hedge, to push aside a branch that leans too far into the ditch, to feel the sharpness of a blackthorn spike that warns of a gap perhaps hidden behind the leaves. Your walk now slows to a different pace, not from weariness but from the care required to read the ground. On the pasture side, the ditch bank rises to a low, grassy lip that you can see over without effort, and beyond it the rough grazing stretches away with a few sheep scattered across it, their shape small and still in the distance. On the hedge side, the bank is steeper and woven with roots that have broken through the soil, the twisted grey-brown fingers of hawthorn and the paler, finer roots of the elder, all of them spreading into the ditch and holding the earth in place. You look into the ditch to see if any of that earth has crumbled in, loosened by the last rain or by the scrabbling of some creature searching for grubs. A fresh fall is easy to spot. The soil will be dark and damp, not yet dried to the same color as the surrounding leaf litter, and the roots that had once been buried will be exposed and hanging. You find no such fall today, but you do see a place where a fox has scraped a small hollow beneath the spreading roots of a hawthorn, a hollow just large enough for a paw to have dug into, but not yet a full earth. You crouch and look into the hollow, seeing the smooth, round tunnel that curves away into darkness, and you push a stone into the entrance to block it, not to harm the fox, but to discourage it from widening the hole and undermining the bank. The stone fits neatly, and you cover it with a handful of leaves so that it will not stand out. Your stick, a length of hazel that you cut from the hedge's own encroachment weeks ago, serves now to prod the bottom of the ditch, checking the depth of the silt that has gathered. You push the end down through the layers of leaves, feeling the resistance change as it passes from dry to damp and then to the firm, sticky clay beneath. The depth is about the width of your spread hand, a little deeper in the center where the water runs, and though it has built up with the dust of the summer and the first fall of leaves, it is not yet enough to block the slow trickle of drainage that keeps the meadow dry. You will need to mention it when the manor court meets after Michaelmas, so that a day can be given to the commoners to dig out the ditch, but that is a thought for a future day, not for this one. For now, the ditch is clear enough to carry the winter rain, and you are satisfied. A little further along, where the ground dips slightly and the ditch becomes a shallow pool of still, brown water, you stop to check whether the water is pooling where it should not, standing too long and turning sour, breeding midges and softening the roots until the whole bank might slump. The pool is no wider than a cartwheel and only as deep as your ankle, its surface covered with a film of dust and the fallen leaves that float like small curled boats, and you stir it with the end of the stick, watching the water clear for a moment before the silt clouds again. There is no stagnant smell, only the clean, cold scent of wet earth, and you see a water beetle dart away from the disturbance, its movement a sudden, tiny ripple that disappears into the shadow of an overhanging root. The water will drain slowly as the ground drinks it, and if it does not, the livestock will drink it down, so you leave it as it is, a temporary pool that is part of the season and not a sign of any failing. You climb up onto the bank for a pace or two to walk along the top of the hedge, where the grass is shorter and your view extends across both strips. From here you can see the ploughed field on the other side, the long ridges of dark soil where the winter wheat has already been sown, and the first faint green of the sprouts is beginning to show in the furrows, a colour so pale and fine that it might be a trick of the light. The field is empty of people, the whole landscape as still as a painting, and the only sound is the distant steady cawing of rooks in the elms that stand at the far boundary, a sound so constant that it has become a kind of silence itself. You step back down into the ditch and continue your slow progress, the stick in your hand now tapping the bank every few paces, a rhythmic accompaniment to your footsteps that keeps the mind from wandering too far from the task. On the hedge side, your attention is caught by a gap where a branch has died back, the bark peeling away and the wood beneath gone grey and brittle, so that the whole limb has snapped under its own weight during some windy night and now hangs downward, still attached by a shred of bark. The gap it has left is just wide enough for a stray ewe to push through, and when you push your own arm into the opening, you can feel the loose, crumbly wood that would give way if any weight were pressed against it. You take hold of the broken branch with both hands and pull, not sharply, but with a steady, slow pressure, and it comes away from the living wood with a tearing sound that is soft and fibrous, like old cloth rending. You break it into 3 pieces, each the length of your forearm, and then you crouch at the gap and begin to lay the pieces across the opening in a rough lattice, weaving them between the live branches to form a temporary mend. The dead wood is light and brittle, and it cracks if you bend it too far, so you work with a patient, gentle touch, fitting each piece into place and pressing it down until it holds. The gap is now closed, not neatly, but well enough, a barrier that will turn a sheep aside until the farmer can come with a billhook and cut a proper pleature to lay into the hedge and weave it tight. You stand back and look at the mend, thinking no more of it. It will last a week or a month, and by then the hedge will have been laid properly for the winter, the whole length of it cut and bent and staked, in the old way that closes every gap for years. The morning light has strengthened while you have been walking, shifting from the pale grey of early day to a broader, milkier brightness that still holds no direct sun. The diffuse glow seems to come from everywhere at once, so that even the underside of the hedge branches is faintly lit and the shadows are no more than smudges on the ground. The ditch ahead of you continues its straight course, and you follow it with the same slow, measured tread, your eyes moving from the bank to the water, channel to the hedge and back again in a steady, unvarying cycle. You see the pale stalks of dead nettles, the brittle remains of cow parsley that have bleached to a greyish white and tremble in the faintest breath of air, the small dark leaves of the herb Robert that have turned a deep red with the cold nights and cling to the bank in scattered patches. All of these you note without pausing, the details filing themselves into the quiet catalogue of the walk, and none of them require any action. At about the midpoint of the hedge, the character of the ditch changes slightly as it passes through a place where the clay is mixed with sand, and here the bank has crumbled in a series of small, dry fragments that have slid down and half buried the leaves at the bottom. You stop and use your stick to scrape the fragments back up, pushing them into the hollow from which they fell, and you pack them with the heel of your boot, not because the damage is great, but because a small slump, if left, will become a larger one after the winter rains, and the Hayward's work is to catch things while they are still small. The sandy soil is moist and cold, and it clings to the sole of your boot so that you leave a trail of dark prints on the grass when you walk on. After 20 paces, the prints have worn away and your boots are clean again, and the ditch returns to its familiar clay, smooth and grey and pocked with the holes of worms. You now come to a section where the hedge has been allowed to grow tall, the hawthorn rising into small trees with trunks as thick as your wrist, and beneath them the blackthorn forms a dense underlayer of spiky, interlacing branches that are almost impossible to push through. Here the ditch is shallower, and the bank on the hedge side is held by a deep mat of roots, so that there is very little to check. You walk more quickly through this part, your stick tapping the top of the bank rather than the bottom, and you look up into the canopy of the hawthorn, seeing the red haws clustered on the twigs like small dull jewels. A flock of starlings lifts from the topmost branches as you pass, their wings making a soft, whirring sound, and they sweep away across the ploughed field in a tight dark cloud that wheels once and then vanishes into the distance. You watch them go for only a moment. Then your eyes return to the ditch and the hedge and the ground at your feet. Where the hedge ends, it gives way to a low bank of earth planted with a few struggling hazels, their leaves already fallen and their branches bare except for the catkins that are beginning to form, small and tight and grey, against the twig. The ditch too begins to shallow out, its sides becoming less steep and its bottom rising gradually to meet the level of the surrounding field. You climb out of it for the last time, your boots slipping a little on the damp grass of the slope, and you stand at the corner where the boundary now turns toward the upper common. From here you can look back along the full length of the ditch and the hedge you have just walked, a dark straight line that recedes toward the oak and the fence and the village beyond, and you can see that all is as it should be. The hedge is continuous, the ditch is clear, the temporary mend you made is already invisible at this distance, merged back into the whole. The morning has advanced, the rooks have fallen quiet for a spell, and the world seems to hold its breath in the long, slow pause between the tasks of the day. You turn your face toward the rise of the upper common, and you walk on, the staff tapping a steady rhythm that continues without hurry into the quiet hours that lie ahead. The ground rises gently as you approach the upper common, a slow, almost imperceptible lift that you feel more in your legs than see with your eyes. The ditch has fallen away behind you, and the tall hedge has given way to a low bank of rough grass and scattered stones. The kind of bank that marks the edge of the grazing, where the soil thins and the chalk plies close beneath the surface. Your boots find a new track here, one worn by sheep rather than men, a narrow, winding path that follows the contour of the slope and is padded firm by the repeated press of small hooves over many seasons. You step onto it with the ease of long habit, your staff now swinging in a lower arc, its end brushing the grass every third stride. The air up here feels different, a little cooler, a little more open, with a very faint breeze that moves across the common without anything to stop it, carrying the dry herbal scent of the gorse bushes that dot the slope in dark green clumps. The upper common spreads before you as a wide stretch of rough grazing, a piece of land that belongs to the whole village and has never been ploughed, the same turf that has been grazed since the earliest memory of the place. The grass here is not the smooth sward of the lower pasture, but a mixture of coarse fescue and bent grass that grows in tussocks, clumps of wiry green that stand up from the shorter turf like uncombed tufts of hair. Between the tussocks the ground is bare in places, showing the pale flinty soil and the occasional scatter of rabbit droppings, small and dark and dry. The gorse bushes are scattered across the slope without any pattern, some of them tall and spreading, others low and compact, and a few of the bushes still carry a handful of yellow flowers that glow softly even in the diffused light, the last blooms of the year clinging on into the autumn. Further off, toward the top of the rise, the ground levels out into a broad plateau where the boundary stone stands, a grey shape against the paler grey of the sky, and beyond that, the land falls away again into the valley where the brook runs hidden among alders. This is the part of the walk where you most often encounter animals that have drifted away from their own pasture. Because the common has no internal fences, only the outer boundary that you are walking, and the sheep will wander as their grazing takes them, following the sweetest bits of grass or seeking shelter behind the gorse when the wind blows. You slow your pace even further, letting your eyes sweep across the whole field of vision in that soft open way that catches movement before it catches shape. Near the middle of the slope you see a small flock of the village ewes, 10 or 12 of them, scattered in a loose group and all facing the same way, their heads down and their jaws moving with the steady, sideways motion of cud chewing. They are where they should be, well within the line of the boundary, and you note them with a brief glance before your attention moves on. But further up, near the edge of the common where the ground begins to flatten toward the plateau, you spot 3 sheep that are not where they should be. They are 100 paces beyond the boundary stone, cropping grass near a patch of bracken that marks the edge of the Lord's demesne, a piece of land that the villagers may not graze. The bracken has turned a deep, rusty brown, its fronds curling and dry, and the sheep are half hidden among it, their white fleeces catching the light in a way that makes them easy to see once you know to look. You stop on the track, planting your staff and standing still for a long moment while you assess the situation. The sheep are not panicked. They are simply eating, moving a step, eating again, their heads lifting only occasionally to look around with the blank, untroubled gaze of animals that have no sense of boundaries at all. There is no shepherd with them, no dog, no sign that anyone else has noticed their straying. It falls to you, as it often does on this part of the walk, to put them right. You do not shout or wave your arms, because shouting would only scatter them further, sending them running in the wrong direction and perhaps through another gap that you do not yet know about. Instead, you leave the track and begin to walk a wide, slow arc that will bring you around behind them, the staff held low and still at your side, so that it does not catch the light and flash a warning. Your footsteps slow even more as you cross the rough grass, the tussocks making the ground uneven, so that you must lift your feet a little higher to avoid stumbling, and you feel the slight burn of the extra effort in your calves. The sheep do not notice you at first, or if they do not care. You are still far enough away that you are merely a shape in the distance, a part of the landscape rather than a threat. You continue the arc, walking now parallel to the bracken patch, and gradually you begin to turn inward, closing the distance by degrees, the way a slow cloud shadow moves across a field. When you are about 40 paces from the sheep, the nearest one lifts its head and looks at you directly. It is an older ewe, her fleece heavy and greyish, her face dark with the bare skin that shows around the eyes and nose. She stands utterly still, watching you with a gaze that holds no fear and no curiosity, merely a kind of dull assessment, as if she is trying to decide whether you are worth the effort of moving. You stop, letting her look, and you stand with your weight on one foot and your body turned slightly away, presenting the least threatening shape you can. After a long, slow count, the ewe lowers her head again and takes another mouthful of grass, and the other two sheep, which had lifted their heads in response to her movement, do the same. You resume your walk, moving now in a gentle curve that will bring you to the far side of the bracken patch, cutting off any escape toward the demesne, and leaving only one easy path open, back toward the common. The bracken rustles against your legs as you pass through its outer edge, the fronds dry and brittle, making a soft, papery sound that the sheep can certainly hear but do not react to. You are close enough now to see the details of their fleeces, the small burrs of burdock that have caught in the wool near the shoulders, the way the wool parts along the spine to show the darker undercoat, the black shiny hooves that are small and precise on the rough ground. You can smell them too, a warm, oily, slightly sour smell that is not unpleasant, the smell of wool and grass and the faint tang of lanolin. You step out of the bracken on the far side, and now you are between the sheep and the demesne, your body a quiet barrier that they understand without needing to be told. The nearest ewe lifts her head again, chews once, then turns and begins to amble slowly back toward the common, her hooves making a soft clicking sound as they knock against a scatter of flints. The other two follow without hesitation, falling into single file behind her, and the three of them move away across the grass with the slow, rolling gait of animals that have nowhere to be and no particular urgency. You let them go, watching their progress until they are well past the boundary stone and have rejoined the loose flock on the slope. Then you walk back yourself, retracing your arc, but more directly now, and you pause at the boundary stone to make your daily check. The stone is a grey slab of limestone, roughly squared, set into the turf so long ago that the grass has grown right up to its edges and a cushion of moss has formed along its base on the northern side. The carved cross on its face is worn almost smooth by the weather of centuries, no more than a faint, shallow groove that you can feel with your fingertip more easily than you can see with your eye. You place your hand flat on the top of the stone, feeling the cool, rough surface and the slight give of the moss beneath your palm. The stone is still here, still upright, still exactly where it was yesterday and where it has been since the boundary was first walked, and that is all you need to know. You do not linger, because there is nothing to linger for. The stone is simply a marker, a fixed point in a world of slow but constant change, and its steadfastness is its only message. From the boundary stone you look back across the upper common, taking in the whole sweep of it from the plateau down to the ditch you walked earlier. The sheep are all accounted for now, the flock gathered loosely in the middle of the slope, and the gorse bushes stand undisturbed, their yellow flowers small bright points in the grey light. The sky remains the same even sheet of cloud, but it has thickened slightly, the grey deepening from pearl to a softer, darker tone that might mean rain later in the day or might mean nothing at all. A single raven flies overhead, its wings making a slow, rhythmic creaking sound that you can hear even from the ground, and you watch it cross the common and disappear over the rise without calling once. The silence it leaves behind is deep and complete, the kind of silence that seems to ring in the ears, and you stand in it for a moment longer before you turn away from the stone and resume your walk. The boundary now leads you downhill from the plateau toward the brook, the ground dropping away more sharply than it rose, and the track becomes stonier underfoot, scattered with small loose flints that roll and click beneath your boots. You walk with care here, placing each foot deliberately, the staff reaching forward to test the ground ahead when the stones look unsteady. The grass gives way to patches of bare chalk, white and dry, and then to a thin soil dotted with the dark green leaves of wild thyme that release a faint, sharp fragrance when your boots crush them. The slope levels out at the bottom, and ahead of you the land opens into a narrow valley where a line of alders marks the course of the brook, their trunks pale and straight against the darker background of the copse. The sound of the water reaches you before you can see it, a low, continuous murmur that is the first new sound in hours, a note of liquid constancy that runs beneath the silence and promises the next stage of your walk. You head toward it with the same steady pace, your mind already turning to the brook and the alder copse and the small, quiet tasks that await you there. From the stone, the boundary follows a small brook downhill, its course marked by a line of pale alder trunks that rise from the valley bottom and grow thicker as the slope steepens. You leave the plateau with its wide sky and scattered flints, stepping onto a narrow path that angles across the face of the slope, a path worn not by men, but by the sheep that come down to drink at the water's edge. The ground here is a mixture of chalk rubble and thin turf, and your boots send small stones skittering ahead of you, their clatter swallowed by the rising sound of the brook. The water can be heard long before it is seen, a low, continuous murmur that grows steadily louder as you descend, a sound composed of many small ripples and splashes merging into a single, steady note. It is the first mew sound in hours, different from the wind in the grass or the distant rooks, and you let it fill your ears as you walk, a liquid constancy that seems to draw you downward. The brook comes into view at the base of the slope, where the ground levels briefly into a narrow strip of flat, damp grass dotted with the dark, round leaves of water mint. The stream is not wide. You could step across it without stretching, and in most places the water rises no higher than the middle of your shin. It runs over a bed of brown pebbles and small water-worn stones that gleam with a dull, wet shine through the clarity of the current. The flow is shallow and clear, so clear that you can see every detail of the bottom, the pale grains of sand that drift into tiny dunes behind the larger stones, the dark, fibrous strands of waterweed that wave gently in the pool, the occasional flash of a minnow darting from shadow to shadow. The surface is broken into countless small ripples where the water pushes over the pebbles, and these ripples catch the grey light and scatter it into a soft, moving shimmer that is restful to watch. You walk along the bank, one foot on the grass and the other sometimes sinking slightly into the soft margin where the soil is dark and damp, patterned with the slots of sheep and the smaller, sharper prints of a heron that must have stood here at dawn. The bank is low and uneven, undercut in places by the winter flow so that small overhangs of turf lean out over the water, their roots exposed and washed clean. Your progress is slow, because this stretch requires you to look at the brook itself to see that its course has not been altered by a fallen branch or by cattle trampling the bank into mud. The change in the course of a stream, even a small one, can send water spilling into the meadow and turn good grass to a sour, boggy mess that will yield no hay. So you watch the line of the water as you walk, noting the places where it runs straight and true, the places where it curves gently around a natural bend, the places where the bank has crumbled a little and narrowed the channel. A few paces along you find a place where a stone has been dislodged from the bank and now sits in the middle of the stream, dividing the flow into two smaller currents that run around it with a soft, gurgling sound. The stone is not large, the size of a loaf of bread, and it has probably been kicked in by a sheep crossing the brook on some earlier day. You step down into the cold water, the shock of it rising through your boot leather and gripping your ankle, and you lift the stone out with both hands, feeling its weight and the slick, cold texture of its water-worn surface. You carry it back to the bank and place it among the grass, where it will stay, and then you smooth the disturbed bed with the toe of your boot, letting the water run clear again before you climb back onto the bank. The cold lingers in your foot for a few strides before fading, and you walk on, shaking the excess water from your boot with a slight, habitual flick of the ankle. Further along, the brook runs close under the spreading branches of a large alder, its roots reaching into the water like a cage of knotted fingers, and here you find a single alder limb that has dropped across the stream. The limb is not large, no thicker than your wrist at its base, but it spans the full width of the brook and has caught a small raft of fallen leaves and twigs against its upstream side, creating a tiny dam that raises the water level by no more than a finger's width. A limb like this, if left, will catch more debris, and after a storm it could cause the water to back up and flood the bank. You step carefully into the cold water again, this time finding a foothold on the cleaner stones, and you take hold of the limb at its midpoint, lifting it free with a slow, steady pull. The bark is smooth and grey, still supple, and the wood beneath is pale and damp. You carry it to the bank and lay it on the grass above the waterline, where it can dry and later be collected for firewood by whoever walks this way and has need of it. The leaves and twigs that had gathered behind it now drift free, spinning slowly downstream and disappearing around a bend, and the water level settles back to its proper height with a barely perceptible sigh. You climb out of the brook and stand on the bank for a moment, looking back upstream to see if any other branches have fallen across the water. The view is clear, the brook winding away toward the upper common and disappearing into its own narrow valley, the alders and willows lining its course in a rough, uneven procession. A dipper flies low over the water, its wings beating fast and direct, and it follows the brook around the bend, vanishing from sight without a call. You resume your walk, the bank now becoming firmer underfoot as the ground rises slightly and the grass grows thicker, mixed with the broad, dark leaves of comfrey and the tall, brittle stems of willow herb that have already shed their seed, leaving only a few tattered strands of white fluff caught in the dry seed pods. The alder copse begins where the brook runs through a slight hollow, the trees growing closer together and their trunks rising straight and pale from a floor of dark, wet leaf litter. The path narrows here to a trodden line through ferns, the fronds brown and curling at the edges, some still holding a faint green at the center. Inside the copse, the air is stiller than it was on the open bank, the wind cut off by the density of the trunks, so that nothing moves except the slow drift of a single falling leaf, a yellow alder leaf that spirals down and settles on the moss without a sound. The light is green filtered, the grey sky above translated by the remaining leaves into a soft underwater glow that seems to press gently against your eyes, asking nothing of them. Your footsteps are muffled by moss, a thick, deep moss that carpets the ground between the ferns and the roots, a moss of many shades of green from pale, almost yellow cushions to darker, richer patches that grow in the constant shade of the trunks. It is a quiet place, quieter even than the open common. A place where the brook's murmur becomes a hushed, private sound that seems to belong to the trees themselves. You follow the path through the copse, your pace slowing still further in the hushed air, the staff now held lightly and used more for balance than for testing the ground. The path is a thin line of bare earth that weaves between the older trunks, sometimes disappearing under a fallen frond or a patch of moss and then reappearing a pace or two further on, as faint as a memory. You know it by feel, the way your boots know the slight dip and rise of the ground, the way your body remembers to duck under a low branch that leans across the path at the height of your eyes. The branch is the same one you have ducked under every day, a curved alder limb that has grown horizontally from a trunk and now forms a natural arch, and you pass under it without thinking, your head lowering by the exact amount needed. At the heart of the copse, the brook widens into a small, still pool before continuing its downward course, the surface of the pool so calm and dark that it reflects the alder trunks and the grey sky above in a perfect, unmoving mirror. You pause beside the pool looking into its depths, seeing the smooth, round stones on the bottom and the long, trailing strands of water weed that rise from the depths like dark green hair. A water boatman skates across the surface, its movements leaving tiny dimples that spread and vanish, and a single leaf floats motionless at the edge, caught between two stones. There is nothing to check here. The pool is deep enough to hold a little water through the driest summer and large enough to give the sheep a place to drink without damaging the bank, and it has not changed in any way since you last saw it. You stand for a moment longer, letting the deep stillness of the place settle into your mind, and then you move on, following the path as it climbs slightly out of the hollow and approaches the edge of the copse. Where the trees thin and the light begins to brighten, you come to the fence that separates the copse from the ploughed field above. The fence is a simple one, a row of alder posts set into the soil with two rails running between them, its purpose to keep the livestock from wandering out of the common grazing and onto the cultivated strips, where a stray cow could destroy a whole furlong of young wheat in a morning. You approach it slowly, your eyes already travelling along the line, checking the posts for rot and the rails for breaks. The posts are still sound, their bases dark with damp, but their upper parts dry and solid, the bark peeling in small curled strips that reveal the pale smooth wood beneath. You run your hand over the top rail, feeling the grain under your palm, the same smooth weathered surface you have felt 100 times, and you find no splinters, no cracks, no places where the wood has begun to bow or sag. The lower rail is equally sound, its gap above the ground even and close, no wider than the spread of your hand at any point. You walk the full length of the fence, which is not long, perhaps 30 paces from the edge of the copse to the corner where it meets a low stone wall that marks the ploughed field's boundary. At each post you give a slight push with your hand, testing for looseness, and each one holds firm, the earth packed tight around its base and the stones wedged in as you remember them. At the final post you notice that the rail has shifted slightly in its mortise, the peg having dried and shrunk a little so that the rail can move if pushed hard. You find a thin wedge of wood lying in the grass, perhaps left there by yourself on an earlier walk, or dropped by the carpenter who built the fence, and you tap it into the gap with the heel of your hand until the rail sits tight. The wedge fits perfectly, and you leave it there, knowing it will swell with the winter damp and hold for a long time. Beyond the fence, the ploughed field rises in a gentle slope, the ridges of dark soil stretching away to a distant hedge, the winter wheat already showing as a fine green haze in the furrows. The field is empty, the sky above it still that same even grey, and the only movement is the slow circling of a buzzard high overhead, its wings held stiff and motionless on a current of air you cannot feel. You stand at the corner of the fence and the wall, looking out over the field for a long, quiet moment, and then you turn back toward the copse, your inspection complete. The fence is sound, the copse is quiet, the brook flows clear and unblocked, and all is in order. You walk back through the trees, the path now leading you toward the far edge of the copse where the cart track lies waiting, the next leg of the boundary stretching away across the open ground under the soft, unchanging light. Emerging from the copse, you step out from beneath the last of the alders and into a light that feels broader and cleaner after the green dimness of the trees. The air moves more freely here, a faint breeze stirring across the open ground and carrying the dry, dusty scent of the cart track that lies just ahead. You pause for a moment at the edge of the copse, letting your eyes adjust to the change, and you take in the scene before you, a wide, flat stretch of rough grass that runs between the copse and the ploughed field, and cutting across it in a straight, unwavering line is the cart track that will now become your path. The track is old as the field system itself, worn into the landscape by centuries of wains hauling the harvest from the farthest strips back to the village barns, and it shows its age in every rut and hollow. You step onto the track and immediately feel the change underfoot. The surface is deeply rutted, the ruts formed by the iron-bound wheels of the harvest wains that pass this way in August and September, their heavy loads pressing the soft earth into parallel channels that have now baked hard under the dry days of the autumn just past. The ruts are as deep as the length of your thumb in places, their sides steep and their bottoms smooth, the clay fired to a dull grey-brown hardness that rings faintly when your staff taps against it. Between the ruts runs a raised strip of grass and weeds, a narrow centre ridge that has escaped the wheels and now offers the easiest walking, and you move onto it with the practiced step of someone who has walked this track in all its seasons. The grass on the ridge is short and tough, mixed with the flat, dark leaves of plantain that spread their rosettes flat against the soil, and here and there a small pale stone has worked its way to the surface and been polished by the passage of feet. You begin to walk along the center line of the track, your boots finding a steady rhythm on the grass strip, the staff tapping the hardened clay of the rut to your left in a slow, metallic tick that marks each pace. The track stretches ahead of you, straight and empty, running due south toward the junction where it meets the lane to the mill, and from here you can see the whole length of it receding into the distance, the ruts narrowing to thin, dark lines that converge at a point just below the horizon. The ploughed field lies on your right, the ridges of dark soil running parallel to the track for a while before they curve away to follow the contour of the slope. On your left, the rough grazing of the common continues, dotted with the same gorse bushes and tussocks of coarse grass that you walked among on the upper slope, though here the ground is flatter and the grass is cropped shorter by the sheep that come down to drink at the brook. As you walk, you let your eyes travel along the length of the track, noting its condition with the quiet, habitual attention that has become second nature to you. The ruts are deep, but not dangerous. A cart could still pass without tipping, though the driver would need to keep his wheels in the channels and his team steady. The surface between the ruts is cracked in places where the clay has dried and shrunk, forming a network of fine angular lines that spread like the veins of a leaf, and a few loose flakes of dried mud have curled up at the edges, ready to be ground to dust by the next wheel. You see no fresh hoofprints, no sign that a horse or ox has passed this way since the last rain, and the only track marks are old, their edges rounded by the weather. The track is exactly as you left it yesterday, and that is all you need to know. The breeze strengthens slightly as you walk, stirring the dry grass at the sides of the track and sending a few loose seeds of plantain drifting across the ruts. The sky above you remains that same even sheet of cloud, but it has begun to thin a little, the grey lightening to a paler, almost silvery tone that suggests the sun might break through later in the afternoon, or might not. A single crow flies low over the field, its wings beating with a slow, deliberate stroke, and it caws once, a harsh, solitary note that hangs in the air for a moment and then fades, leaving the silence deeper than before. You watch the crow until it disappears behind a distant hedge, and then your eyes return to the track and the task ahead. The junction comes into view gradually as you approach the halfway point of this leg. You can see where the cart track intersects with the lane to the mill, the lane running at a right angle from the village on your left to the mill on your right, its surface a pale ribbon of beaten chalk that cuts across the darker earth of the field. At the junction stands the gate, a heavy construction of oak that has been set across the cart track to control the movement of animals between the common and the lane. It is a 5-bar gate, its uprights and horizontals made from split oak heartwood that has weathered to a dark, silvery grey, and it hangs on 2 great iron hooks driven into a massive oak post that serves as the hinge side. The gate is old. You can tell by the way the wood is worn smooth at the latch end, polished by countless hands lifting it open and closed, and by the deep, dark cracks that have opened along the grain of the top bar. Cracks that have been there for years and have never widened enough to weaken the whole. You approach it with your pace unchanged, your eyes already moving over its surfaces, checking for the signs of wear and misalignment that you know to look for. The gate sometimes slips its upper hinge when the ground is uneven, the post having settled slightly over the years so that the whole structure leans a fraction toward the lane, and the top hinge does not always hold as firmly as it should. You stop at the gate and set your staff against the post, freeing your hands for the inspection. First you look at the hinges, 2 heavy iron straps that wrap around the hanging stile and curl over into hooks that rest in iron eyes driven into the post. The lower hinge is solid, its hook seated deeply in its eye, a faint smear of old grease still dark on the metal. The upper hinge is in place, but you can see that the hook has ridden up a little. Not enough to disengage, but enough that if a heavy animal were to push against the gate, the hook might jump free and let the whole gate sag. You set your hand against the top bar and lift, feeling the slight clunk as the hook drops back fully into its eye, and then you step back to look at the alignment of the gate as a whole. The gate hangs straight, or as straight as a gate of this age can hang. The bottom corner on the latch side has a slight wear, a smooth, rounded hollow where the wood has scraped against the ground over many openings, the grass there worn away to bare earth. You crouch and run your finger over the warm spot, feeling the hard, polished surface, and you note that the wear is no deeper than it was last week, no fresh splinters, no white wood showing through. The gate still closes properly, the latch falling into its catch with a solid, satisfying thud that you know well. But before you test the swing, you check the wedge that holds the latch post firm, a small oak wedge driven between the post and the stone that butts against it on the ground side. The wedge is loose, having dried out in the autumn air and shrunk a little, so that you can pull it free with your fingers without effort. Without the wedge, the post can move slightly, and the gate will sag and drag on the ground. You find the wedge in the grass, where it must have fallen during the last day or two, and you push it back into the gap with the flat of your hand, tapping it home with the heel until it sits tight and the post no longer moves when you lean on it. The wedge is a small thing, no larger than a child's wooden toy, but its absence or presence is the difference between a gate that works and a gate that fails, and you are satisfied now that it is in place. With the wedge set, you undo the latch. a simple iron bar that lifts with a loop at the top, and you swing the gate through its full arc, feeling for any catch or drag. The gate moves smoothly, the hinges creaking only slightly, and the bottom corner clears the ground by the width of a finger all the way through its travel. You swing it closed again, gently, letting the latch drop into its catch with that quiet, firm sound, and you stand for a moment with your hand resting on the top bar, feeling the solid weight of the gate under your palm. The gate is sound, the junction is clear, and the boundary is secure. You pick up your staff from where it leans against the post, and you take a last look at the gate, noting the way the grey light catches the grain of the oak, the small dark knots that dot the wood, like the eyes of a tree that still remembers growing, the tuft of sheep's wool caught on a splinter near the latch that you now pick free and let float away on the breeze. From the gate, the cart track continues straight ahead, heading through a gap in the hedge that borders the lane and then out across the next field, where it will eventually reach the furlong stones. The lane to the mill runs off to your right, a narrow, sunken way between high banks of earth and hedge, dropping down toward the sound of the mill stream that you can just hear now, a distant, continuous rush of water over the weir. To your left, the lane leads back toward the village, and you can see the church tower rising above the trees, its stone a pale, worn grey against the sky. The bell silent at this hour. You stand at the junction for a moment longer, looking one way and then the other. But there are no carts on the lane, no people walking, no movement at all except the slow drift of a single leaf spinning down from a nearby ash tree. The world is quiet, holding its breath in the soft, still middle of the day, and you turn away from the gate and resume your walk along the cart track. The track beyond the gate is less rutted than the section you have just walked, because the wains turn off here to take the lane to the mill rather than continuing straight on, and the traffic is lighter. The grass strip in the center is wider and softer, and the ruts are shallower, their edges crumbling away into the weeds that have begun to reclaim the margins. You walk at the same steady pace, your boots making a softer sound now, muffled by the thicker grass, and the staff taps the ground with a dull, rhythmic thud that echoes the beating of your own heart. The hedge on either side of the track grows taller here, hawthorn and hazel mixed with the occasional field maple, their leaves turning from green to a pale buttery yellow that will soon deepen to gold. A few rose hips hang on the briars, bright red points in the tangle of brown and green, and the spiders have spun their webs between the twigs, the silk catching the light in faint, trembling sheets that are almost invisible until you are right upon them. You walk through this tunnel of hedge with a sense of enclosure that is not confining but comforting, the high banks and the interlaced branches creating a sheltered passage that feels separate from the rest of the world. The breeze does not reach you here, and the air is still and cool, carrying the damp, earthy scent of the hedge bottom and the faint, sweet fragrance of the last few honeysuckle flowers that have survived into the autumn. A wren flits from one hazel stem to another, its small brown body moving with a quick, jerky energy, and it chirrs a soft, scolding note at your passing before disappearing into the thickest part of the hedge. You do not pause for the wren, but its small presence registers in your awareness, another piece of the quiet life of the boundary that goes on around you as you walk. The cart track stretches on, straight and empty, and you follow its center line with the same unhurried, methodical tread that has carried you all the way from the cottage door. The rhythm of the walk has become so deeply ingrained now that you are barely aware of your own movement. Your legs lift and lower, your arms swing gently, the staff taps and lifts, and the whole of it runs on like the mechanism of the mill at the bottom of the lane, a steady, unvarying motion that requires no thought. Your mind, too, has settled into a kind of quiet hum, not empty but filled with the simple, direct impressions of the walk, the feel of the grass under your boots, the sight of the track receding into the distance, the sound of your own breath steady and even in your ears. There is no need to think of anything beyond what lies just ahead, no need to plan or to remember, only to walk and to observe, and to let the boundary unfold itself before you at its own slow pace. Ahead, the hedge begins to thin out, and you can see the open field again through the gaps in the branches, the dark plough ridges stretching away to a distant line of trees that marks the next part of the boundary. The track will soon reach the furlong stones, a row of small, lime-washed markers that divide the strips of 3 different tenants, and you will walk from stone to stone, counting them as you always do, the counting a quiet ritual that occupies the mind without demanding anything of it. But that is still some distance off, and for now you are content to walk this straight, sheltered length of track, your eyes moving slowly from the grass at your feet to the hedge on either side, noting the small details that make up the whole: a fallen hazel leaf lying on the grass, its surface covered with tiny drops of moisture, a spider's web strung between two hawthorn twigs, the silk sagging slightly under the weight of the dew, a single blackberry, overripe and soft, still clinging to its stem. All of these things you see and let pass, the quiet catalogue of the walk growing longer with each step, and none of them require anything more than your attention. The light continues to shift as you walk, the grey cloud thinning and thickening in slow, lazy waves that sometimes let through a faint, diffused brightness, and sometimes cast the world into a deeper shadow. The shadows of the hedge branches move on the ground before you, hazy and indistinct, never sharp enough to have a clear edge, and they drift and reshape themselves as the cloud moves overhead. A slow, silent dance that has been going on all morning without your noticing. You notice it now, the gentle play of light and shade on the track, and you let it be another part of the quiet rhythm, a visual counterpart to the steady sound of your footsteps and the tap of your staff. After a time, the track begins to emerge from the hedge-lined section, the banks falling away and the view opening out again to the wider landscape. You can see the furlong stones now, small pale shapes in the distance, set in a straight row across the stubble field that stretches before you. The cart track will end at the field's edge, and the boundary will turn once more, cutting across the stubble toward the stones. You walk on, the gate now far behind you, the junction and the lane and the mill stream all left to their own quietude, and you carry with you the small satisfaction of a task completed without fuss or hurry. The gate is secure, the wedge is tight, the track is clear, and the boundary continues unbroken into the afternoon that lies ahead, as steady and as patient as the land itself. Where the cart track ends, the boundary turns sharply away from the familiar ruts and cuts across a furlong of stubble toward a line of stones that stands in the middle distance, small and pale against the darker earth. You leave the grass ridge and step onto the ploughed field, feeling at once the change in the surface under your boots. The stubble is a rough, prickly carpet of cut straw that rises no higher than your ankle, the stalks dry and hollow, snapping softly with each footfall. The field stretches away on both sides in long, parallel ridges left by the plough, their crests rounded and smooth, their furrows holding the last faint green of chickweed that has not yet been turned under. Walking across the ridges requires a slight adjustment of your stride, a lifting of the foot at the crest, and a longer step into the hollow, and you settle into this new rhythm without thought, your body adapting to the ground the way it has adapted to every surface you have crossed today. The line of stones lies directly ahead, a row of markers set to divide 3 tenants' strips, and you can see them now more clearly. Small, grey lumps no higher than your knee, evenly spaced and aligned with a care that speaks of a time when the strips were first measured out with rods and cords, and the names of the holders were entered in the manor roll. The stones have been there longer than anyone alive can remember, and they have acquired the settled look of things that belong to the earth, their bases deep in the soil, their tops weathered, but still showing the faint pale trace of the lime wash that is renewed each autumn, so that they will be visible even in the dim light of a winter dusk. The lime is a thin, chalky white, barely more than a suggestion against the grey stone, and it catches the diffused light and holds it softly, making each stone a point of quiet brightness in the monotony of the stubble field. You slow your pace as you approach the first stone, not because you need to rest, but because the ritual of the stones asks for a slower, more deliberate attention. The counting of the furlong markers is an old part of the Hayward's walk, not done from any fear that a stone might have been taken away overnight, but simply because the counting occupies the mind in a pleasant, steady way, a repetition that requires just enough attention to keep the thoughts from wandering while still allowing the body to move in its familiar rhythm. You begin at the first stone, pausing beside it for a moment to look along the row and to take the measure of the whole line. The stones are set about 12 paces apart, and you can see them all from here, 8 stones marching across the stubble to the hedge that marks the far boundary, each one a slightly different shape according to the block the quarry yielded, but all of them squared off by the mason's chisel, so that they sit upright and present a flat face toward the plough. You lay your hand on the top of the first stone, feeling the rough, cold surface and the slight grittiness of the dried lime, and then you step away and walk to the second. The counting happens in your mind without your needing to speak the numbers aloud, a silent tally that ticks forward with each stone you pass. As you walk, you let your eyes rest on the details of each stone. The first has a deep, dark fissure running diagonally across its face, filled with a cushion of grey-green moss. The second is smoother, its top rounded like a loaf of bread. The third leans a little to the left, as it has done for years, a lean so slight that you only notice it because you are looking for it. The fourth has a chip missing from one corner, a fresh break that shows the pale, clean stone beneath the weathered surface, and this break is new, probably the fall of You make a note of the chip, adding it to the quiet list of things that might need attention. Though a chipped corner does not affect the stone's purpose. The counting continues, a soft, regular pulse that matches the beat of your footsteps, and you move from stone to stone without haste, each one a small, familiar landmark that confirms the boundary's integrity. At the fourth stone, however, you notice something out of place, something that does not belong to the quiet order of the stones. Beyond the stone, a little way to the right, stands the remains of an old fence post. A stout timber that once belonged to a neglected enclosure around a small orchard that has long since been abandoned and grown over with bramble and young thorn. The post leans now at a sharp angle, its base rotten and ragged where the damp has worked into the grain, and it has fallen against a young plum tree that struggles beneath its weight. The slender trunk bent and one branch cracked through, but still living, its leaves a sickly yellow. The rest of the old fence has vanished, the rails long ago taken for firewood or rotted into the soil, but this one post has persisted, its upper half still sound, and now it has become a problem that you will need to attend to. You stop at the stone and turn your attention from the boundary line to the leaning post, assessing it with the same calm, methodical gaze that you have brought to everything today. The post is of oak. You can tell by the tight, swirling grain that shows where the bark has peeled away, and it was once a solid piece of hardwood, selected for its strength and driven deep into the earth. Now the lower portion is soft and fibrous, eaten by the slow work of dampened fungi, the wood crumbling away in brown spongy flakes when you touch it with your finger. The lean is severe, the top of the post pressing hard into the fork of the young plum, and if the post is not removed, it will continue to weigh on the tree and may kill it before the spring. More than that, a leaning post is a temptation to a passing boy or a stray animal, something that could fall completely and perhaps injure a sheep or block the plough on its next pass. The task is a simple one, requiring no tools but your hands and your boot heel, and you set about it without any sense of urgency. You approach the post and first try to lift it free from the plum tree, taking hold of the upper section where the wood is still hard and dry. The post is heavier than it looks, its weight increased by the damp that has soaked into the lower part, and you need to brace your feet in the stubble and lift with a slow, steady pull, using your legs rather than your back. The rotten base gives way with a soft, tearing sound as the last fibers snap, and the post comes free of the ground, leaving behind a dark, ragged hole that smells of earth and decay. You carry the post a few paces away from the plum tree, the weight of it solid across your shoulder, and you lay it down on a patch of bare soil at the edge of the field where the grass begins to thicken. Here you can break it into manageable pieces, converting a piece of waste into something that might be useful. With the post laid flat, you take a moment to look at the plum tree, which now stands free and upright, its bent trunk already seeming to ease a little now that the pressure is removed. The cracked branch hangs down at a sad angle, but the break is not complete, and the tree will likely heal itself over the winter, sealing the wound with its own slow, sappy scar. You brush a few dry leaves from the tree's lower branches, a small, instinctive gesture of care, and then you turn your attention back to the post. The upper half is still sound, the wood a pale honey-brown color, and ringed with tight growth rings that speak of many slow years in a hedgerow. The lower half is rotten beyond any use, but the whole of it will burn, and dry oak burns hot and long, so it is worth the small effort of breaking it down. You use the heel of your boot to start the break, stamping down on the post at the point where the sound wood meets the rot, and the fibers separate with a sharp, clean crack that echoes briefly across the open field. Another stamp, and the post splits into two pieces, one long and straight, the other a short, ragged chunk of the rotten base. You pick up the rotten piece and crumble it between your hands, reducing it to a handful of dark, fibrous fragments that you scatter on the soil, where they will return to the earth by spring. The long piece you break again, stepping on it at the midpoint and pulling upward until it snaps, the sound drier this time, a crisp wooden report that is satisfying in its finality. You now have 3 pieces of dry oak, none longer than your arm, and you gather them up and carry them to the edge of the field, where you stack them neatly against the base of the hedge, just out of the way of the plough, but visible enough that someone passing will see them and know that they are free for the taking. The stack is a small one, 3 split lengths of pale wood with the dark, weathered bark still clinging to one side, and it will be gone by the end of the week, carried away by a cottager in need of kindling, and that is as it should be. You return to the 4th stone, which stands quietly where you left it, its chipped corner catching the light, and you resume the counting that the leaning post had interrupted. The mind picks up the thread easily, the numbers sliding back into their familiar sequence as you walk to the 5th stone, the 6th, the 7th. Each stone is a quiet confirmation, its presence a small, steady fact in the wide, slow-moving world of the field. The 5th stone has a patch of pale yellow lichen spreading across its top like a small continent on a grey map. The 6th is almost buried in a drift of dry soil that has been washed against it by the rain, and you brush the soil away with the side of your boot, revealing the lime-washed face beneath. The 7th stands a little apart, at the corner where the boundary turns again, its face carved with a faint letter that was once the initial of a tenant whose name has been forgotten, but whose strip is still recorded in the court roll. The 8th stone marks the end of the row, set close against the hedge that separates this furlong from the next, and you pause here, placing your hand on it exactly as you did on the first, completing the circuit of the stones. The sky, which has been a steady, even grey all morning and into the early afternoon, has brightened a little as you stood among the stones. The cloud has thinned from a thick, woolly blanket to a finer, milky veil, and the light has taken on a softer, pearlescent quality that seems to rise from the ground as much as it falls from the sky. The stubble field, which had appeared dull and brown under the heavier cloud, now shows a warmer tone, the dry stalks glowing faintly as if lit from within, their pale gold colour emerging beneath the grey. The whole landscape seems to breathe slowly in this changed light, the distant hedges and the dark line of the copse and the soft roll of the upper common, all holding themselves in a gentle suspended stillness. You stand at the 8th stone and let your eyes travel over the scene, taking in the quiet order of the land, the fence you mended, the gate you checked, the ditch you walked, the stones you counted, and you feel the deep, quiet satisfaction of a boundary intact, and a world in its proper place. The sound of the rooks drifts across from the distant elms, a low, continuous chattering that rises and falls with the rhythm of their slow circling, and somewhere far off, a dog barks once, a single, muffled note that is swallowed immediately by the vast, absorbent silence of the fields. You turn from the 8th stone and look toward the next part of the boundary, which leads across a gentle slope to the Sheepwash Hollow, a place you will reach after a short walk across another strip of stubble. For now, however, you are content to stand a moment longer, your staff planted and your weight even on both feet, letting the quiet of the furlong settle around you like a familiar, comfortable garment. The counting is done, the post is cleared, the plum tree is free, and the boundary stones stand in their ancient, patient row, waiting for nothing and for no one, simply holding the line as they have always held it, through autumn and winter and the slow turn of the seasons that will bring you back here again tomorrow, and the day after, to walk the same path and count the same stones under the same soft, grey sky. A little way beyond the stones, the ground begins to change, the flat stubble giving way to a gentle, rolling descent that you feel as a release of tension in your calves, a slight lengthening of your stride downhill. The boundary now leads you across a strip of rough grass dotted with the dark, low mounds of anthills and the occasional scatter of rabbit droppings, and ahead of you the land falls into a natural hollow, a broad, shallow bowl in the earth where the villagers have dug a sheep wash. You can see the dip long before you reach it, the ground dropping away and then rising again on the far side in a low, grassy bank, and you can hear the sound of the spring that feeds it, a faint, liquid trickle that is much softer than the brook. a murmur that seems to come from under the earth itself. The sheep wash is a familiar place, one you have visited on every boundary walk, and you approach it now with the same calm, unhurried tread, your eyes already moving across the slope to read the condition of the bank. The sheep wash is a simple construction, a broad, shallow pool dug out by the villagers generations ago and fed by a spring that rises at the top of the hollow and runs down into the pool through a narrow, stone-lined channel. The pool itself is oval, perhaps 10 paces across at its widest, its bottom lined with flat stones that have been set into the clay to give the sheep a firm footing when they are driven in for washing. The water is clear and still, fed constantly from the spring, so that it never stagnates, and the overflow runs off through a small gap in the lower lip and seeps away into the grass beyond, where it feeds a patch of bright green that stands out against the duller tones of the autumn field. The surface of the pool reflects the grey sky above and the shape of the surrounding bank, and it is so motionless that it might be a sheet of polished metal laid in the grass. A single strand of waterweed trails from an underwater stone, waving very gently in the invisible current, and a few fallen leaves float motionless at the edges, their colours muted to a dull brown by the water. The boundary runs along the upper lip of this hollow, not through the pool itself, but along the rim, following the natural contour of the land, and you must inspect the bank for signs of erosion, where the sheep have made their way down to the water. The path that the sheep take is worn into the grass at the near side of the hollow, a broad trodden way that angles down the slope from the upper lip to the water's edge, and you can see it clearly. The grass is worn away to bare earth, and the earth itself is polished smooth by the repeated pressure of small hooves over many seasons. The path is the only way the sheep can reach the water, because the rest of the bank is too steep for them, and so it receives the full force of the flock's daily movement, a constant, gentle erosion that works on the soil like a slow, patient tool. You stop at the top of the slope and look down at the path, assessing its condition with a quiet, practiced eye. The soil is damp from the spray of the spring, a dark, fine silt that holds the shape of every hoofprint, and you can see that the repeated pressure has worn the path deeper since you last walked here. The center of it now a shallow gully that channels rainwater down into the pool, carrying with it a fine load of soil that clouds the water and settles on the stones at the bottom. At one point, near the water's edge, the path has crumbled at the side, the bank undercut by the splashing of the sheep as they wade in, so that a small overhang has formed and then collapsed, sending a slide of dark, wet soil into the pool. The soil has fanned out over the flat stones, a smear of brown in the clear water, and it will need to be cleared away before it builds up and makes the bottom soft and muddy. This is a small matter, a routine part of the sheep wash's maintenance, and you set about it without any sense of urgency, stepping carefully down the worn path to the edge of the pool. At the water's edge, you crouch and look into the pool, seeing the stones that line the bottom and the dark fan of soil that has spread across them. The water is cold. You can feel the chill of it through the air at its surface, and you know that in a few more weeks the sheep will be brought down here for the autumn washing, driven by the shepherd and his dog, and the pool will be churned to mud and foam, the air filled with the bleating of ewes and the shouts of men. But for now, the pool is quiet, and the only sound is the soft, steady trickle of the spring, and the occasional plop of a water drop falling from an overhanging grass blade. You dip your fingers into the water, feeling the sharp, clean cold, and you begin to scoop the fallen soil from the stones, lifting it away in small, wet handfuls that cloud the water as you work and then settle. The soil is fine and silky, full of tiny fragments of root and grass, and you deposit each handful on the bank beside you, building a small wet pile that will dry and crumble and eventually blow away on the wind. It takes only a few minutes to clear most of the soil from the stones, restoring the firm, clean footing that the sheep will need, and when you are satisfied, you rinse your hands in the cold water and stand up again. The next task is the eroded bank itself, the place where the soil has crumbled away and left a small raw hollow. You climb back up the path to the spot, a few paces above the water, and you examine the damage more closely. The hollow is not deep, no more than the width of your hand, but it has created a vertical edge that will continue to crumble as the sheep pass, and if it is not filled, the path will become a rutted gully that is difficult for the animals to use and that channels too much soil into the pool. The repair is a simple one. the oldest and most familiar of all the Hayward small skills. You need to fill the hollow with stones and then pack soil over them, creating a firmer step that will resist the pressure of hooves and water. You walk up to the top of the hollow, where the spring rises from a cleft in the chalk and spills over a small lip of stone into the channel that feeds the pool, and here you find the materials you need. The spring's outflow has, over the years, scattered a collection of small flat stones across the grass, pieces of the chalk and flint that the water has freed from the earth and carried a little way before dropping them. The stones are mostly the size of your palm or smaller, flat and smooth, perfect for bedding into a path, and you gather a loose armful of them, feeling their cool, damp weight against your tunic. You carry them back down to the eroded spot and kneel at the edge of the path, laying the stones out beside you in a neat row, the way a mason might arrange his materials before beginning a wall. The work of bedding the stones into the worn path is quiet and methodical, a task that occupies your hands while your mind remains still and calm. You take the first stone, a flat oval piece of grey-white chalk, and you set it into the hollow at the bottom, pressing it down into the damp soil until it sits firm and level. The second stone goes beside it, a darker piece of flint with a rough, napped edge, its flat face uppermost, and you tap it into place with the heel of your hand, feeling the soil give way and then resist. The third stone is a wedge of chalk that fits neatly into a gap, the fourth a longer, narrower piece that bridges the front edge of the hollow, and so you continue, placing stone after stone in a rough mosaic that fills the eroded space and creates a new, firm surface. The stones nestle together without any need for mortar, the damp soil packing around their edges and holding them in place, and when you have laid the last of them, you scoop up some of the loose soil from the pile you made earlier and work it into the cracks between the stones, smoothing the surface with the flat of your palm until it is a single, even step that will withstand the sheep and the rain alike. The repair might last a season or a year or longer. The winter frosts will test it and the spring rains, but for now it is sound and you are satisfied. You stand up, brushing the soil from your hands onto your tunic, and you look down at the path you have mended. The new stones are pale against the darker earth, but they will soon weather and darken and become indistinguishable from the rest of the path, and the sheep will walk over them without noticing any difference, and the path will remain as it has always remained, a quiet, functional thing that asks for nothing but occasional care. You turn away from the slope and walk along the upper lip of the hollow, continuing the boundary where it runs around the far side of the pool. The grass here shorter and unmarked by hooves, the ground firm underfoot. The water in the pool is motionless now, the sediment from your work having settled back to the bottom, and it reflects the grey sky and the shape of your own outline bent over the path as you pass. You pause for a moment at the overflow, where the water seeps out through a gap in the lower lip and spreads into a shallow, boggy patch of grass that is greener than anything else on the common, a vivid, almost startling green that seems to belong to another season. The overflow is clear, the gap unblocked by leaves or soil, and the water runs freely away into a narrow runnel that winds through the grass and eventually joins the brook you walked earlier. You follow the runnel with your eyes for a few paces, seeing the way it cuts a small dark line through the pasture before disappearing into a clump of rushes, and then you turn your attention back to the boundary and resume your walk. The far side of the hollow rises gently back to the level of the surrounding field, and you climb the slope with a slightly heavier step, feeling the small effort in your thighs, the first sign of the long walk in your legs. At the top you pause and look back at the sheepwash hollow, taking in the whole of it, the pool, still and dark and round, the worn path, now mended and firm, the spring trickling endlessly from its cleft in the chalk, the green, boggy patch at the overflow, the rushes and the runnel, and the distant dark line of the copse beyond. The scene is a quiet one, a place of practical, everyday purpose, and it holds a simple, functional beauty that you appreciate without needing to name it. The sheep wash is ready for the flock. The bank is secure, and the water runs clean and clear, and that is all that matters. You turn away from the hollow and continue along the boundary, which now runs in a long, gradual curve across a stretch of open pasture, heading back toward the village. The light has begun to soften further, the grey of the sky taking on a hint of a warmer tone, the colour of old pewter rather than new iron, and you know that the afternoon is beginning its slow turn toward evening. Though there are still hours of daylight left, the village lies ahead of you, invisible yet hidden behind the next rise and the next hedge. But you can feel its presence now, the way a sailor feels the land before he sees it. The boundary will lead you along the village lane, past the cottage gardens and the smithy and the church tower, and then back to your own cottage door, where the walk will end. But that is still some distance off, and for now you are content to walk this quiet, curving stretch of pasture, the staff tapping its steady rhythm, your eyes moving across the grass and the sky and the distant dark shapes of the hedgerows, holding the whole slow world in a calm, attentive gaze that asks for nothing and finds everything in order. The last curve of the pasture brings you at length to a stile set into a low hedge, a simple step of 2 stone slabs, and a single wooden rail that marks the place where the boundary leaves the common and enters the village lane. You cross the stile with the unhurried, automatic motion of a man who has crossed it 1,000 times, your hand resting on the rail for balance, and your boot finding the worn hollow on the top stone where the feet of generations have shaped the chalk. Beyond the stile, the lane begins as a rough, grassy track between 2 hedges, the branches meeting overhead to form a tunnel of brown and green that filters the light and gives a brief cool shade before the open lane proper. The ground underfoot changes from the soft turf of the common to a beaten surface of packed earth and small broken flints, the same surface you walked at the start of the day, and you feel the change in the way your boots strike the ground. A firmer, drier sound that echoes slightly between the hedgerows. This lane is the final third of the boundary, the part that traces the edge of the village itself. On your left, the common grazing still stretches away behind its boundary wall, a low grey barrier of limestone blocks that have been gathered from the fields over centuries and set without mortar, their weight alone holding them in place. On your right, the cottage gardens begin, one after another, each a small patch of ground enclosed by its own fence or hedge, planted now with the stubble of harvested vegetables and the bare canes of beans and the occasional late apple tree still holding a few red fruits in its thinning branches. The gardens are quiet, no smoke rising from the chimneys yet, no voices calling, no dobs stirring, only the silent, patient presence of the things that grow, and the things that shelter them. Topped with a wooden fence, the wall divides the common grazing from those gardens, and it is this fence that now becomes the focus of your attention for the next part of the walk. You approach the wall and begin to walk along it, your left hand moving to the top of the stones, feeling the rough, cool texture of the limestone and the smoother patches of the occasional flint that has been pressed into a gap. The wall is old, its stones covered with patches of grey and orange lichen, and in the cracks between them grow small, hardy plants, stonecrop with its fleshy, pale green leaves, and the dried, brittle stems of warroo, and tufts of moss so dark and dense they look like patches of shadow. The wooden fence that rises above the wall is made of upright pales split from oak and chestnut, each one roughly shaped and pointed at the top, the pales set close together and nailed to 2 horizontal rails that run from post to post. The fence is not high, reaching only to your chest, but it is enough to keep sheep from jumping into the bean rows and cows from pushing through into the cabbages. You begin your check at the first post, a solid square of oak set into the end of the wall where the lane bends slightly, and you let your eyes move upward from the base of the post to the rails and the pales, and then along the line as far as the next bend, a stretch of perhaps 40 paces that takes in the gardens of the first 3 cottages. Your hand moves from the stone wall to the top rail of the fence, feeling the familiar, smooth grain of the wood under your palm. The rail is dry and warm from the long afternoon, and it carries a faint, dusty scent of old timber. You walk slowly, your attention flickering between the overall line of the fence and the individual pales, each one a separate fact to be noted and passed. The first 3 pales are sound, the nails holding tight, the wood grey and weathered, but not cracked. The 4th has a slight outward bow, as if something leaned against it from the garden side, perhaps a ladder or a heavy branch, and you make a mental note to mention it to the cottager, though the pale is not loose and the bow is slight enough to be left for now. The 5th, 6th, and 7th are straight and firm. The 8th has a knot that has fallen out, leaving a small, round hole through which a sparrow could pass, but not a lamb, and you pass it by. The 9th and 10th are the last before the first gate that leads into the garden of the widow Tanner, and here you stop, because the 10th pale is loose. You can see the looseness before you touch it. The pail leans outward from the bottom rail, the nail that should hold it having worked its way free and fallen into the grass somewhere below. The pail is still held by the top nail, but it swings slightly when pushed, a motion that would let a determined you shoulder it aside and step through into the garden, where the winter greens are still in the ground. You crouch at the base of the fence, setting your staff aside against the wall, and you look for the lost nail in the grass, parting the dry stems with your fingers. The grass is short here, cropped by the village geese, and the nail is easy to find, a hand-forged iron spike with a square shank and a flat, splayed head that has been hammered many times. It lies in a small depression of bare earth, still clean, not yet rusted, and you pick it up and hold it in your palm while you examine the pail and the rail. The hole in the rail is slightly enlarged from the pail's movement, but not so much that the nail will not hold, and the wood of the pail itself is sound. You ease the pail back into its proper position, aligning it with its neighbors, and then you press the nail back into the hole with your thumb, feeling the slight resistance as the iron bites into the wood. With the heel of your hand, you tap the nail home, each tap a soft, rhythmic thud that echoes dully along the wall. The pail sits firm again, no longer swinging, and you test the neighboring pails with a gentle shake to be sure that the movement has not loosened them in turn. They hold steady, the whole section now as tight and true as it was meant to be. You pick up your staff and continue along the wall, leaving the widow Tanner's garden and passing the next cottage, a small whitewashed house with a low thatch and a single window shuttered against the afternoon light. Its garden is a neat square of turned earth with a row of leeks still standing, their blue-green leaves stiff and straight, and the fence here is newer. The pails are paler grey, the males still bright, and it requires no attention beyond a brief glance. Your walk progresses in this way, a slow, steady movement along the lane, your hand tracing the stones in the rails, your eyes sweeping from post to post, from pail to pail. The wall itself is sound, the stones settled into their ancient, unmoving order, and you see no cracks, no bulges, no places where the winter frost has shifted a stone out of alignment. The lane is as quiet as the common was, the only sound the scrape of your boots on the flints and the soft tap of the staff on the occasional loose stone. As you near the smithy, the character of the lane changes slightly. The wall on the common side lowers, and the fence becomes a more substantial barrier of iron-bound posts, because this is where the village oxen sometimes gather before being taken to the common for water. The posts are set deeper, the rails thicker, and the pails have been replaced by heavy, horizontal beams that nothing short of a bull could shift. You inspect these beams with the same care, running your hand along their tops and finding the iron straps that hold them to the posts still solid, the rivets tight, the rust on the iron only a thin brown bloom that comes off on your fingers like fine dust. The smithy itself is dark and silent, the great doors closed, the anvil invisible in the shadow of the forge, the smell of cold iron and old charcoal hanging in the air around it, a sharp metallic tang that catches at the back of your throat and then passes. You pause for a moment at the water trough that stands outside the smithy, a hollowed log fed by a pipe from the same spring that fills the sheep wash, and you see that the water is clean and the trough is full. The surf is still and reflecting the dark roof of the smithy and the grey sky above. The overflow runs away in a shallow channel across the lane, and you step over it as you move on. Beyond the smithy, the lane widens into the village green, a broad open space of grass that is the centre of the community, the place where the geese graze and the children play, and the village meetings are held under the great elm that stands at the far end. The green is empty now, the geese gathered in a tight white flock near the pond on the far side, their heads tucked under their wings, and the elm stands dark and still, its leaves beginning to yellow and drop one by one onto the grass below. The church tower rises beyond the elm, a square, sturdy mass of grey stone with a clock face that has only one hand. The bell visible through the arched openings of the belfry, but silent at this hour, waiting for the evening bell, ringer to call the village to rest. The sight of the tower is a comfort to you, a familiar point of reference that tells you how far you have come and how little remains of the walk. The light has softened again, the grey of the sky now tinged with the faintest hint of a warmer colour near the western horizon, where the cloud is beginning to thin and break, and the whole scene holds that quiet, suspended quality that belongs to the late afternoon in autumn, when the day is not yet ending, but the first shadows have started to lengthen. The boundary does not cross the green. Instead, it skirts the edge, following a narrow path that runs along the back of the cottages on the green's eastern side. Here the wall has become a low, dry stone structure, and the wooden fence has given way to a series of wattle hurdles, the woven panels of hazel and willow that are light enough to be moved but strong enough to keep the sheep from straying onto the green and fouling the grass with their droppings. The hurdles are set between posts, and they lean slightly outward at the top. Their woven surfaces a patchwork of brown and grey, and the occasional pale strip of striped willow that gleams in the dim light. You check each hurdle with a gentle push, feeling the slight give of the weave and then the firm resistance of the post behind it. The wattle is old in some places, the withies dry and brittle, and you find one panel where a hazel rod has snapped, leaving a triangular gap at the lower corner. The gap is not large, but it is enough for a goose to squeeze through, and a goose in a cottage garden can do a great deal of damage in a short time. You look around for a spare withy, finding one tucked behind the post where it was left for just such a purpose. A long, supple rod of hazel that has been soaking in the water trough and is now pliable enough to weave. You thread it through the gap, bending it carefully so that it does not crack, and you work it into the existing weave, over and under, until the gap is closed and the new rod is indistinguishable from the old, except for its slightly lighter color. The repair takes only a minute, and you press the hurdle back into place and move on. The path behind the cottages is a private, quiet place, a narrow strip of trodden earth that runs between the back walls of the houses and the common boundary, and you walk it now with a sense of near completion, the end of the circuit drawing closer with each step. The cottages on your right show their working faces, the wood piles stacked neatly against the wall, the rain barrel half full and covered with a board, the small square garden plots where herbs and simples are grown, the occasional cat watching you from a wall top with eyes that reflect the grey sky in a flash of green. A thin wisp of smoke rises from one chimney, the first you have seen all day, and it drifts upward in a straight white column before catching a breath of breeze and dissolving, the smell of burning beechwood reaching you a moment later, sweet and clean. You pass the weaver's cottage, where the loom stands silent behind a window, its warp threads a faint, pale grid in the dimness, and then the bakehouse, its door open a crack and the warm, yeast-scented air spilling out onto the path, telling you that tomorrow's bread is already rising inside. You do not stop at any of these places. They are part of the walk, the quiet, unchanging background against which your task is set, and you acknowledge them with a glance and pass on. At the corner where the path meets the lane again, you come to the final gate, a small, simple gate of woven withy that hangs on leather hinges and leads from the common into the narrow strip of land behind your own cottage. This gate is the last thing to check before the circuit is complete, and you approach it with the same care you brought to the first post of the lower pasture fence, a long, slow loop of attention that is now almost closed. The gate is light and well made, the withies still green enough to be supple, and it opens and closes without drag. The leather hinges silent and the latch dropping into its notch with a soft, firm click. You stand at the gate and look back along the lane, seeing the green and the elm and the church tower beyond, the whole village arranged in its quiet, familiar order under the softening sky, and you feel the deep, quiet satisfaction of a task nearly completed, a boundary walked from end to end and found secure. The lane behind you is empty. The rooks have settled in the elms, the light is draining slowly toward evening, and the world holds itself in a long, gentle pause. You lift the latch and step through the gate, closing it behind you, and you walk the last few paces toward your own cottage door, the staff now silent at your side. The walk almost done, the fields left to their quietude as the day draws on toward its close. The final segment of the boundary brings you full circle to the back of your own cottage, a narrow strip of ground where the common's edge meets the row of small outbuildings and garden plots that belong to the homes along this side of the village. You have walked the length of the lane and passed through the woven gate, and now you stand on the trodden path that runs behind the cottages, the same path you left at dawn. But approached now from the opposite direction, your shadow falling long and soft on the grass ahead of you, the light a deepening golden grey that speaks of the late afternoon's slow descent toward evening. The air has cooled a little, not enough to chill, but enough to carry the first hint of the coming dusk, and the scent of wood smoke from the chimney you noticed earlier has grown stronger, mingling with the damp green smell of the grass and the faint clean odour of the well water that you will soon draw. Your legs carry the weight of the full walk now, a pleasant tired heaviness that is familiar and not unwelcome, the kind of ache that comes from steady, unhurried labour and promises a deep, restful night. Before you go inside, there are two small checks that remain, the last duties of the Hayward circuit, and you turn your steps first toward the stack of winter hay that stands at the end of the row, a large, neatly built mound of dried grass that was cut from the meadow you inspected in the morning and has now been stored here to feed the village livestock through the cold months. The haystack is enclosed by a ring of wattle hurdles, the same kind you mended on the green, but larger and more robust, their panels set in a circle around the base of the stack to keep the sheep and the cattle from pulling at the loose hay and wasting it. The hurdles are weathered to a silvery grey, their woven hazel rods tight and firm, and you walk slowly around the circle, your hand pushing gently against each panel to test its strength and to feel for any give that might indicate a broken withy or a post that has worked loose. The first panel is solid, the second equally so, the third lets out a slight creak as you press it, but the hazel holds and the post behind it does not shift. You continue around the full circuit, finding no gaps, no snapped rods, no places where an animal has tried to push through and left a tuft of fleece or a muddy hoof mark on the wattle. The haystack is secure, its sweet, dry scent rising from the center in a warm, grassy cloud that hangs around you for a moment as you complete the circle and step back. The sheep will have their feed when the snow comes, and that is a small, quiet satisfaction that requires no further thought. From the haystack, you walk the short distance to the henhouse, a low wooden structure with a sloping roof of turf that is tucked against the back wall of the cottage garden. Its door a simple plank that lifts aside and its run enclosed by a fence of chicken wire made from twisted hemp and thin withies. The hens are already inside. You can hear the soft, murmuring plucks from within, the rustle of feathers as they settle onto their perches for the night, and you do not disturb them. Instead, you check the door to see that it is securely closed against the foxes that sometimes come down from the copse in the dark hours, and you run your hand along the bottom of the run, feeling for any place where the wire has pulled away from the frame or where a hole has been scratched in the earth beneath it. The wire is taut and whole, the ground beneath it firm and packed, and you find a single feather caught in the mesh, a small brown speckled thing that drifts free when you touch it and spins away across the grass. Everything is as it should be, the hens safe, the haystack protected, the boundary walked and found unbroken, and you turn now toward the well and the final, quiet task of the day. The well stands near the corner of the cottage, a low circle of stone with a wooden cover and a windlass of turned oak that has been darkened by the grip of many hands over many years. The bucket hangs from the rope, its iron hoop and wooden staves still damp from the last drawing, and you lift the cover and set it aside, leaning over the stone rim to look down into the darkness where the water lies far below, a faint, glimmering circle of reflected sky that is the color of pewter. The air that rises from the well is cool and clean, carrying the mineral scent of the chalk aquifer that feeds it, and you breathe it in for a moment before taking hold of the windlass handle and beginning to lower the bucket. The windlass turns with a soft, rhythmic creaking, the rope unwinding steadily, and the bucket descends into the darkness until you hear the light splash that tells you it has met the water. You let it fill, feeling the slight extra weight on the handle, and then you begin to turn the windlass in the opposite direction, the creaking now slower and more labored as the full bucket rises. The rope dripping cold drops onto the stone at your feet. When the bucket reaches the top, you swing it over to the rim and set it down, the water sloshing gently against the staves, and you take the dipper that hangs from a nail on the well post, a simple cup carved from a single piece of beechwood, smooth and dark with age. You dip the cup into the bucket and draw up a dipper full of water, holding it for a moment to let the slight sediment settle. Then you drink. The water is cold and clean, tasting of the chalk and the deep earth, A taste that is so familiar it is almost beyond taste, more a sensation of clarity than of flavor. You drink the whole cup slowly, feeling the cold spread down through your chest, and then you dip a second dipperful and pour it over your hands, washing away the last traces of soil from the sheet wash and the dust from the cart track and the faint, sticky residue of the oak post that you broke at the furlong stones. The water runs off your hands and splashes onto the grass, darkening the soil in small round dots that vanish quickly into the dry ground. You dry your hands on the coarse cloth of your tunic and replace the dipper on its nail, standing for a moment longer by the well, letting the quiet of the evening settle around you like a second, softer garment. The light has changed perceptibly in the time you have been behind the cottages. When you look up now, you see that the grey cloud has finally begun to break apart in the west, and a pale, golden band of light is spreading along the horizon, the first direct sunlight you have seen all day. It falls across the common fields in long slanting rays that turn the stubble to a warm honey colour and catch the tops of the gorse bushes on the upper common, lighting them with a soft yellow glow that is almost the same colour as their flowers. The elms on the far boundary stand dark against this brightness, their branches outlined with a fine golden edge, and the rooks that have been silent for hours now begin to stir, a few of them lifting from the trees and circling slowly, their calls ringing out across the quiet air with a sound that is both harsh and beautiful, the voice of the day ending. The whole landscape seems to pause in this light, the fields and the hedgerows and the distant copse all holding themselves still as the sun slips lower, and you stand watching for a long quiet moment, your staff planted beside you and your weight even on both feet, taking in the view that you have walked through all day and that now reveals itself in this last, brief wash of gold. You carry the bucket to the cottage door and set it on the stone step, where you will bring it inside later for the evening's needs, and then you stand the staff against the wall by the door, placing it in the same notch in the plaster, where it has rested every night since the start of the season. The ash wood is warm from your hand, the darker grip, polished section at the top, giving way to the paler, unhandled length below, and you lean it carefully so that it will not slip in the night. The cottage door stands before you, the same door you closed behind you in the half-light of the morning, its timber dark and solid, the iron latch cool under your fingers as you lift it and step inside. The interior is dim after the brightness of the evening sky, the single window letting in only a soft grey light that falls across the earth floor and touches the edge of the wooden table, the bench, the cold hearth with its pile of ash, and the small, neat stack of kindling that you will use to start the fire for your supper. The cottage is quiet, the roof beams settling with a soft, occasional creak, and the whole space holds the stillness of a room that has waited undisturbed through the hours of daylight. You close the door and let the latch fall with a quiet click, the sound a small final note that marks the end of the walk. The fields outside are now shut away, left to their own quietude, the boundary walked from end to end and found whole, the fence rails pressed back into their notches, the hedge gap filled with dead wood, the ditch cleared, the stray sheep guided back to the common, the brook freed of its fallen limb, the gate wedge hammered home, the leaning post broken and stacked, the sheep wash bank mended with flat stones, the loose pail nailed back into its place, the wattle herds checked and said that the half ready had fed out the baydage. Every task that the day asked for has been completed, every small repair made, every animal accounted for, every post and rail and stone still standing in its proper place. You stand for a moment just inside the door, letting your eyes adjust to the dimness, and you feel the deep, quiet satisfaction of work done, without hurry or praise, the kind of satisfaction that asks for no recognition because it is complete in itself. A quiet, steady hum that fills the space behind your ribs, and then settles into a calm silence. The dusk will deepen outside, the golden light fading to grey and then to a soft dark blue, the rooks settling back into the elms and the first stars beginning to show through the thinning cloud. But you will be inside by then, the fire lit and the hearth warming the small room, the day's walk already fading into the quiet, half-remembered blur of things that are so familiar they leave no sharp trace. Tomorrow you will wake in the same grey light, pick up the same staff, open the same door, and begin the same circuit. The boundary that never changes and always changes, the fields and the hedges and the stones waiting for you with the same patient, undemanding presence that has greeted you every morning of this season, and will greet you again until the season ends and the winter comes and the Hayward's work turns to other tasks. But that is a thought for another day. For now, you are inside, the cottage wrapped around you, the evening ahead long and quiet, and the fields outside rest under the fading light, exactly as they should, whole and peaceful and complete.